Hi everyone, thank you so much for inviting me here today. Thank you to Judy, to Natalie and all the team as well for organising this. It's really a pleasure and also just a bit terrifying to follow Professor Christina Samavali. In this talk I'm actually not going to talk about Kiva. Instead I wanted to spend some time thinking about the involvement in families in bullying. Because this is an issue that affects young people and their families, but our focus, rightly or wrongly, is usually on the school and the wider environment around the child. So in this talk, we'll be exploring ways in which we might want to include families, and some questions for you as well at the end that I'm hoping to get your feedback on. I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which more negative relationships at home can unfortunately predict which young children are involved in bullying, both as victims but also as young people who might perpetrate bullying. I'm going to think about some of the mechanisms for this, thinking about nature and nurture, for example. And then I'm going to focus on the positives, on the many ways in which we believe that families might promote resilience to bullying victimization. And I hope I finish in time for our coffee break. That's my aim. Okay, so there is a wealth of literature that on the very much more negative end, unfortunately, there are risk factors at home that might increase a young person's risk of being bullied at school. And so some of my early PhD work looked at young people who had been bullied. We collected lots of information about their lives, about their individual characteristics that might increase their risk of being bullied, whether or not they had symptoms of depression and anxiety, whether or not they showed behavioural problems. And even when we adjusted for all of these other variables, socioeconomic status, mother and father, mental health, even then, what we found is that young people who experienced maltreatment at home, and this was physical abuse measured in this study, they were twice as likely as children who hadn't been maltreated to be bullied at school. And this for me was really quite a devastating finding, because we would really hope that those young people who were having such a difficult time at home would find a safe place at school. I phrase it this way because one thing we have to be really careful with these kinds of findings is this is the risk going forward, as it were, but please remember that most young people who have been bullied won't have experienced maltreatment at home. We can't use this as a sort of indicator of what's going on at home, but rather when we know that we're dealing with vulnerable families, we should consider this risk in the school environment. And it's not just direct exposure to violence at home that seems to predict an increased risk of being involved in bullying. We also found in the same study that young people who witnessed domestic violence between the parents were 1.5 times more likely to perpetrate bullying. This was both as bullies and bully victims, as we call in the literature. And there's a big discussion about the role of social learning mechanisms here. If you grow up in a home where you're exposed to violence, you see violence used to gain resources, to gain power, to gain dominance. Perhaps young people are going to school and replicating these behaviours amongst their peers. But it's not just parents who might be modelling use of violence and aggression. I'll talk more actually in a moment about sibling victimisation. But they might be modelling, not beyond violence and aggression. There may be more subtle ways or more harmful or less positive ways in which parenting might unfortunately increase risks of victimisation when young people go to school. So in a recent study by Amber Corday, a young undergraduate student of mine, and Dr. Cinziana Onchario, who's a postdoc in my lab, we were using data from the Twin Life data set, and we were thinking about different types of parenting and whether or not they predict victimization in this sample from Germany at different ages. And what we found is that an overall measure of harsh parenting, so this is not abusive parenting, this is more negative parenting. It involves sort of over-controlling, it involves criticizing children more, it also involved things like changeable parenting, so parents that can be very warm and pleasant one moment and then might flip to being more angry and hostile the next. And we found that overall there was an association between this type of harsh parenting and young people's risk of being bullied at school. And we found that both in the younger years, so we found that when we looked in sort of middle school age, but also in adolescence, which was interesting because I think there is this assumption that as children enter adolescence, parents somehow matter less because peers matter more. And actually the results from this study seem to suggest that that might not be the case, and that in fact, if anything, the effects of parenting on children's risk of difficulties with their peers is similar across age. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just parents that might model sort of negative interactions, and some of my earlier work also looked at the role of siblings, as others have done. And I find it really interesting because sibling bullying then and even now is a topic that is, for some reason, quite controversial. In my mind, it's almost like the topic of bullying was 50 years ago. When 50 years ago people thought bullying was normative, it's how kids learnt how to get along with each other. It was important for them to learn about hierarchies. It was difficult. Since then, our understanding has shifted a lot, and we understand now that this is a major public health problem when it's at school. But interestingly, we don't really see this kind of discussion when the exact same behaviours are played out in the home environment. We see lots of information, lots of data suggesting that young people might be routinely hurt, kicked, made to feel unsafe, scared, have names called, things thrown at them, rumours spread about them by a sibling. And actually, oftentimes, this does happen from an older sibling to a younger sibling. So we have evidence of a power differential, which is something that we think about in the peer bullying literature. It's repetitive, it happens over time, and it's happening at home. So it's very difficult for the young person to escape this. So in this study, I looked at data from nearly 7,000 kids who were then 12 years of age, from the Allspack study, so children of the 90s, if anyone knows it. And a definition of sibling bullying was given to them, which is, this means when a brother or a sister tries to upset you by saying nasty and hurtful things, or completely ignores you from their group of friends, hits, kicks, pushes or shoves you around, tells lies, or makes up false rumours about you. So this is a definition that was adapted from the WAES bullying definition that we use in schools. This was a measure that was put in by Dieter Volke, for those of you who knew him or know him. And what I found in this study is, again, even adjusting for young people's individual characteristics and things like family socioeconomic disadvantage, children who reported being frequently bullied by a sibling at home, so 2 to 3 times a week or more, were twice as likely to have depression at clinical levels. So this is when they were nearly 17 years old, nearly 18 years old in fact. So they're having rates of what we would consider clinical depression that might need some kind of intervention. They were also nearly twice as likely to report that they had self-harmed or to be experiencing different anxiety disorders. And actually, this sort of strength of association is the sort of strength of association we see with peer bullying as well. But I find it interesting because, again, this is not something that is necessarily widely talked about. Other research, not my own, but from other groups, has looked at the fact that kids who are bullied at home by a sibling are much more likely then to go to school and also to be bullied or to bully others. So we know that there is a link there. So again, thinking about social learning mechanisms, these relationships with our siblings are some of our the formative relationships in our lives. It's where we learn how to interact with other young people who are a more similar age to ourselves. And if at home what we're learning is this is how we act to one another, this is what we do to gain attention, resources, who knows, perhaps this is how we learn and model behaviours that then happen in school. And more recently, Elise Sellers, a PhD student of mine, has been looking at a very different data set. So she's looking at the Millennium cohort data set, and again, looking at sibling victimization frequency, this time across adolescence, so at age 11 and age 14. And again, looking at mental health and well-being outcomes at 17 years of age. And once again, what we're finding is that those young people who report experiencing sibling victimization at home are more likely to experience internalizing symptoms. So that's symptoms of depression, anxiety, Externalizing symptoms with effects actually being slightly stronger for girls than for boys. So externalizing symptoms of behavioural difficulties, things like aggression, impulsivity, and so on. There's also indications that those young people who report sibling victimization may have lower well-being. So not just thinking about mental ill health, but also thinking about general well-being at home. And again, concerningly, that these young people are also more likely to report self-harm. So that's two different data sets, both in the UK, but both finding similar evidence that being bullied by a sibling may be associated with really quite negative long-term harms. Oops. I wanted to spend a moment to think about something that, again, we often don't necessarily think about in our research. I mentioned social modelling earlier, and I do think that there's lots of evidence for this, and I do think that's important. For one awful moment, I thought it was my phone, and then it would just keep going through the whole time. I have random alarms all the time. But families don't just pass on nurture to their children. They don't just raise them and model behaviours. They do also pass on genes. So nature is an important thing to consider here, particularly when we're interested in the role of families and young people's behaviour. And that might seem strange when we're talking about behaviours like being bullied at school. But actually, we know from twin studies that have compared identical and non-identical twins that actually genes really matter. They really matter in influencing whether or not you're aggressive and bully others. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, they also matter in whether or not you're more likely to experience being bullied and exposure. And in this study from the e-risk sample by Harriet Ball all the way back in 2008, she found that if you look at pairs of identical twins and you just ask them to report on their on whether or not they've experienced being bullied, identical twins are very similar. So you see a correlation of 72%. And if you compare that to non-identical twins who only share half of their genes, they're more like everyday siblings, the correlation is only 38%. And what does that mean? Well, it means if you're identical twins and non-identical twins who grow up in the same homes, these are not twins separated at birth or anything like that, but if you find that those twins who are genetically identical are more similar than those who share only half of their genes, it tells you that genes matter. And actually, in this particular sample, they found that genetic factors might explain up to 73% of the individual differences of whether or not a child has been bullied. And that's really quite high. And it seems quite shocking and strange. And I think it's also something that can be really easily misinterpreted. So I just wanted to spend a moment on saying, well, what do we actually mean here? What does it mean to say that your genes might be associated with your likelihood of being bullied? Firstly, it's individual differences. And a slight non sequitur, but I think it's important. I often say, we think about the number of fingers on our hands as being something that's very genetically determined, which it is. It is. But if I asked all of you to write down the number of fingers on your hands, and I did the same thing for everyone in Bangor, and then I looked at whether genes explain variance, individual differences in the number of fingers in our hands, actually genes wouldn't explain much variance at all. Why? Because we all have the same number of fingers in our hands. There is not a lot of variance. Where there is variance, it's environmental usually. Someone's lopped off a finger. So that's one thing. Genes, just because something's genetic, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's heritable. But more importantly, any human characteristic, any behaviour, anything to do with us, how we are, how we interact with the world, is at some level influenced by our genes. That's just how things work. And we already know that there are lots of characteristics that might make a young person more vulnerable to being bullied. It doesn't mean we have to change those characteristics at all. We might very well choose not to. But we might want to understand who's more vulnerable, because that actually tells us a lot about social norms and around the environments and around why people might be targeting people who stand out for whatever reason. I'll talk more about that in a second. In other research, I also looked at children who had been victimised across different settings. So in this case, kids who had been bullied both in primary school and in secondary school. And I was interested in the covariance, so those kids who are kind of chronically victimized across different settings. My hypothesis had been that actually genes might explain even more of the variance in young people who are chronically victimized. And interestingly, actually, that's not what I found. Genes still did matter, and they explained up to 47% of the variance. But we also saw an important role of the environment. Something called the shared environment, which is whatever makes twins growing up in the same family more similar. We don't actually know what that is, but we might be thinking about aspects of the home environmental parenting that children receive equally. And we also found a significant influence of what's called the non-shared environment. So that's different environmental experiences young people have that make them diverge from their brothers and sisters. So this study does highlight the importance of the environment as well. So going back to, why should genes matter? Why should we be thinking about this? Well, we already know, as I said, that there are certain individual characteristics that might be associated with an increased risk of being bullied. We already know that things like low self-esteem or having greater depressive symptoms is associated with an increased risk. We know that things like ADHD, or even below ADHD, but difficulties with impulsivity and aggression, children who have these kinds of challenges or characteristics are often more likely to be bullied at school. And these characteristics are influenced both by genes and by environments. That also doesn't mean that these can't be changed either. These are all factors that we have interventions, good interventions for, that can be managed and supported. So none of this is immutable, none of this is deterministic. We're just talking about factors that increase the likelihood of young people being involved in bullying. I also, what have I done here? Not my study, a different study looked at actual genes, so a molecular genetic study, very cool, trying to find out what's going on here. What are the genes that might increase risk of being bullied later on? And they found, as we had predicted, things like ADHD was associated with an increased risk. So was genes that influence whether or not you get a diagnosis of depression, all the way through to a reduced risk with intelligence. But one thing I wanted to highlight here is that in this study, high BMI was associated, so body mass index, being overweight. So genes that predict being overweight also predicted being bullied. And I like to highlight this because I think it's a really nice example. What would we do with this information? Would we go into schools and put children on a diet if they're overweight to reduce their likelihood of being bullied? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Dieting we might do for another intervention if we thought that was an important factor, but we wouldn't do it in a study like this. What this actually tells us is a lot about the social norms of this classroom at that time, of this sample, right? It told us that this was quite a fat-phobic environment for these young people. So the kids that stood out in this environment, that were a little bit more overweight, were more likely to be targeted by bullies. That's all this is really showing us. So just because genes play, they might increase our likelihood, it doesn't mean we can't change them, and it doesn't mean that we want to either. It just tells us a bit more about the complex picture of why some children are involved in bullying. And when we're thinking about families and we're thinking about children, we need to consider the role of genes, because if we ignore them, it's like a big piece of the puzzle is being hidden, and we can't actually understand how strong the relationship is between parents and kids. We can't understand whether this really is social learning mechanisms or if it's something else that's going on. If we were able to disentangle this, we might understand whether we should be targeting things like social learning, or whether we should be helping young people manage things like emotion regulation difficulties and challenges. It might help us to understand where we should put our efforts for intervention and prevention. How do we kind of rule out genetic influences that might come, that might explain some of this? Well, one very easy way is to look at the identical twins. So in these kinds of studies, you take identical twins raised in the same home environment and you just compare them. You correlate differences in their experiences with differences in their behaviours. It's like a case control study, but having a really good comparison group because it's their genetically identical twin. It's as good as you're going to get in many ways. And if you do that, sometimes it means that relationships that you see using standard questionnaire data look quite different. So this is the same slide that I presented to you earlier, where I was saying harsh parenting seemed to be related to young people's involvement in victimization by Cindy and Amber. And actually what we see here is we see different relationships depending on what kinds of analysis we do and what we control for. So phenotypic just means your everyday survey correlation when you collect questionnaires and you correlate it. Adjusted, phenotypic adjusted means we factored out individual characteristics. But this last one in green, that's where we control for genes and environments. That's when we compare our MZ monozygotic identical twins. And what you can see is the association completely goes. It looks like it's in the opposite way, it's actually non-significant. But this is really interesting to me. So this suggests, if I just look at normal survey data, it looks like harsh parenting is associated with an increase of victimization. But actually, when I use the most stringent research design, it no longer is. So at least when we're just thinking of harsh parenting, it means that some of this relationship is explained by shared environment and by children's genes. So it might not be enough to have parenting interventions that are just about sort of harsh parenting. And remember, this is quite low-level harshness. This is not abuse and maltreatment. We've got very strong evidence that that is associated with victimization. This is with different types. But that's when we were considering just this sort of generic harsh parenting. In the same study, it did tell us a little bit more. We went into a bit more detail. We used this kind of more stringent research design, and we did find that some evidence, in particular for inconsistent parenting. So when parents are flipping between warm and cold, setting boundaries, relaxing boundaries, and so on. And we found that in those cases where there was inconsistent parenting at home, we saw worse outcomes, particularly for girls. So for girls, they were more likely to be involved in bullying as victims at school. And that's even using this more stringent research design, adjusting for genes and shared environment. These are small associations, but this gets us one step closer to starting to understand for whom these kinds of interventions might be particularly helpful and what we might want to do about it. In this other paper, again by a different group, they were using this kind of comparing different types of research design. And they were looking again at the overall relationship between being bullied and young people's well-being this time. And this is just to show you the difference you get if you use these different kinds of research designs. So if you use the straightforward survey design, the phenotypic design, you see associations of poor mental health that can persist all the way up to 5 years. You still see that if you compare non-identical twins, but when you control for genes, actually it's a tale of resilience, which is quite nice. You see strong and significant effects concurrently. So young people who are bullied concurrently absolutely have poorer well-being and mental health. And they still show that 2 years later, and that's really important and really concerning. But in this analysis, when you control for genetic predisposition as well, by 5 years, this relationship is tailing off, which is a story of natural resilience. It also suggests that for many young people who were bullied, although there is a likelihood that it will increase their mental health difficulties, that effect might dissipate over time. So the fact that young people are resilient is the last part of my talk and what I really wanted to focus on, because this for me is everything. We've talked, and you'll be hearing more about Kiva and other anti-bullying efforts, and I think our first goal always has to be prevention. It always has to be to reduce bullying. Bullying is unpleasant, it's nasty, and we do have strong evidence that it causes harm for young people. But we will never, unfortunately, stop all cases of bullying. I wish we would, but I think that's highly unlikely. There will always be some kids who have been bullied. And in my work and in others' work, what I've been really interested in is, well, what can we do then? If a young person has experienced bullying, is there something we can do to promote better outcomes for that young person? How do we intervene and to help support them going forward? When we think about promoting resilience to bullying victimisation, like many areas of psychology, we often use a socio-ecological framework. So something like Bronfenbrenner's framework, if you've heard of it. And we know that factors that predict how well you function after adversity come from many different levels. They come from the individual level. How do you process difficulty? How do you respond to it? How do you appraise your own sense of being able to cope? What actions do you take? In the context of bullying, do you seek help? What is your response? But we also know that the family is important. The relationships around a child might help to promote resilience. And then finally, we might be thinking about the wider school or neighbourhood context. There might be factors to consider here. But for this talk, I wanted to zoom in on the area that probably the least amount of work has been done, which is thinking about those family factors that might promote resilience to victimisation. What can parents, siblings, and others in the family do if a young person has been bullied to promote better outcomes? I've talked a lot about what perhaps we might not want to do, but I think it's a much more positive message to focus on what might actually help. So there are different ways in which we can try to model how well kids are doing following an adversity like being bullied. And this is just one way. So in this analysis, we can look at the relationship between being bullied and how well or not a young person is doing. And we can put a line of best fit. This is what our regressions do in our analysis. And it tells us a little bit about how young people might be faring on this sort of line of best fit. So, for example, we could have child A. They're doing about as well as you might expect, given their exposure to bullying, in terms of their adjustment difficulties. You might have these children B. They're actually showing higher or worse adjustments than you might expect, given how much they've been bullied. So for these kids, we might be thinking about the risk factors in their environment that's not supporting them, that's making them suffer more. But likewise, we can learn a lot from those young people who do experience bullying, but somehow emerge unscathed. These are children who are showing more resilience. And I think, looking at the complete distribution of functioning is really important. A lot of our research, understandably, is on when things go wrong, when young people develop depression or anxiety or difficulties. But I think we've got as much to learn from when things go well as we have when they've gone wrong. So you can model this, and then you can think about this full distribution of functioning, from being more vulnerable to developing poor outcomes to showing more resilience. Notice that I show a distribution because one thing I don't like to do is put a line on this. I don't like to say, if you get over a certain mark, you are resilient, or under it, you're not, because that's not what this is about. It's not about saying that this is something with the child that they have to achieve in order to show that they can survive being bullied. It's rather trying to understand how young people respond to this situation and whether we can harness any of the factors that promote doing better for our interventions. So when I looked at different measures of doing better, I considered behavioural resilience, so whether or not kids were showing the expected levels of aggression and impulsivity following their experience of being bullied. And I also looked at emotional resilience, so whether or not they were showing signs of depression or anxiety. And I looked at a number of factors within the home that we had available to us in this data set, which was from the eRisk data set. So we had measures of maternal warmth. This was actually expressed emotion. So it was mums talking about each of their twins and we coded this for overall level of warmth. To give you some indication of what that sounds like, we listened to lots of tapes. Mostly, mums talk about their kids consistently. Unfortunately, it was mostly mums. I don't think we had any dads, or very few dads, talking about their kids in this older data set. But mums would talk about each child, but sometimes there were differences, and sometimes these differences were really quite stark. And you would hear it in the tone, as well as the positive statements said by the child. So, they might talk about Johnny, and he's my ray of light, and he's so funny, he does all these things. But Jack, Jack's really difficult, actually. He's really hard work. I really struggle with Jack. And it's that difference in emotion that we were really looking at in this study. So not just low warmth, but differential low warmth. And I think that's really important. We had a measure of how well kids get along in the family as well, so the sibling warmth. And that's important because I've focused on sibling bullying as a risk factor, but I also wanted to highlight that a positive sibling relationship can be a protective factor as well. It can promote better outcomes for young people. We had measures of the home environment, so the atmosphere at home was our researchers going in and using the home observation survey, if you know about it, whether the kids' artwork was displayed on the wall, whether it was calm or chaotic in the home, what the interactions were like between the parent and the child. And then we also had information on the stimulating activities that the mum and dad engaged in with the child. So we had a range of activities, all low cost or free, so we didn't think this was just about socioeconomic disadvantage. And what we found was all of these measures of the home environment at the positive end were associated with doing better than expected, given your experience of being bullied. So kids who had a warm, whose mother talked about them in a warmer, more friendly tone, who had better relationships with their siblings, who came from these calmer households, they were doing better, both in terms of their behaviour and in terms of their emotions. And that's just associations, they're just things that, associated with doing better. And in a way, maybe that's not so surprising. Why shouldn't they be doing better if they have a better relationship with their mum? Why shouldn't they be doing better if they have a better relationship with their sibling? These are just things that are good for children. And that was interesting to me, but maybe not interesting enough. I could give you a different example, and this would be children who eat well, who have a good diet at home, and vegetables tend to do better. But I wouldn't build an anti-bullying intervention and tell kids to eat more vegetables, even if I know it's associated with them doing well. Like sleep. Kids who sleep well, go to bed early, they do better. But again, I wouldn't necessarily put that into my bullying intervention because it's not specific to them. It's just something that's generally good for health. So in this study, I was then interested in thinking, well, okay, these factors are positive, but are they particularly positive for kids who've been bullied? And we might theorise why they could be, but are they actually, or is it just that they're generically good factors? And so this is a protective factor. This is just a diagram to indicate what that is. It's really an interaction, and it's interesting because they don't have to be variables that are just good for you. They could be things that actually might not be good for you in the absence of risk, but become good for you in the presence of risk, like this airbag. If you're driving along and your airbag explodes, mostly that's not going to be good for your driving, unless you hit another car. Suddenly this saves your life. Okay. So protective factors don't always have to be positive, nice things. They can be things that in that context can lead to better outcomes. And so in this study I used my same family variables, and I was interested this time in thinking, okay, so these are things that are associated with better outcomes, but is the effect greater among bullied children compared to non-bullied children? So bullied children are on the left, non-bullied on the right. The black bars are when the positive factor is high, and the white bars are when it's low, and then I'm looking at emotional and behavioural problems. And what you see if you compare the difference between the bars on each of these graphs is that these variables were also serving to be particularly important in the context of bullying. And like I said, we might theorise why. So a kid that's going to school, that's being bullied, but who can come home and talk with their mum or their dad about this is probably going to do better. We don't know why, we don't know what action mum is taking, we don't know if that involves going to the school, we don't know if it's simply about having a space to talk from our data, but we might start to infer that. Likewise, kids who have a warm relationship with a sibling at home do better. Is that because the sibling is at school and can physically step in and help support that child? Or is it, again, just having a safe place? The fact that we also see this for atmosphere at home tells us it might be more about the kinds of experiences at home that are promoting better outcomes. So for peer bullying at school, factors at home really matter. And one slide I wanted to put up, so Elise also looked at this in the context of sibling bullying. Now this is bullying now that's happening at home, and so she was doing something quite similar and looking at variables that might promote better than expected functioning. And actually, the summary of this slide is that, interestingly, when the bullying is at home, suddenly the promotive factors shift to the school. So kids who are bullied at home but have greater school motivation, greater school engagement, that have a close friend at school do better than those kids who don't, even given their experiences of sibling victimization. Oops. So, families seem to matter. What are we doing about that? Are we seeing this within our bullying interventions? Well, a little bit. In a somewhat older systematic review and meta-analysis by Maria Toffey and David Farrington of over 40 studies, they found that having an element of parent training or parent meetings was an important element that was associated with decreases in both bullying, perpetration, and victimization. They also found that providing information for parents was also correlated with a decrease in bullying. These are fairly light touch involvements, though. This is just information, and actually I think with Kiva as well, it's pretty light touch what we have with parents currently. I should also say that not all studies have replicated this finding. There is a question mark around what we should be doing at home to improve our school interventions. So one question I wanted to put to all of you, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is what should we be doing to meaningfully engage parents in our anti-bullying efforts? We know we should be doing this. There's evidence it works, and that families matter. But I think right now we don't have a good handle on what we should be doing and how we should be engaging parents. So please do let me know. So in summary, I talked a little bit about the negative home environments that might increase risk of being bullied. So children who were abused or who witnessed domestic violence or were bullied by siblings were more at risk of being bullied at school. And this was for reasons of both genes and environments. But finally, I hope I've convinced you that beyond that, we find that family factors might promote resilience and better outcomes. Thank you very much.